The first thing that bothered me was a phone verification code that arrived at the wrong time on the wrong screen. It came through on a Tuesday night while my wife was upstairs drying her hair, and I was in the kitchen pricing Italian cypress for a client who wanted his backyard to look like money had always lived there. My phone was dead on the counter, so I was using the iPad we kept in the kitchen for grocery lists, weather, and whatever else two busy adults use a shared device for when they trust each other enough not to think about the plumbing behind it. A gray notification slid down across the top of the screen. Your verification code for Telegram is 480-1992. That was all. No message thread. No name. Just a code. My wife Meredith did not use Telegram. At least not in any part of our life I knew. She was an international trade representative, which meant she dealt with shipping schedules, overseas suppliers, customs delays, tariffs, clients with time zones instead of sleep, and a level of polished professional calm I had always admired in the abstract because it looked impossible to fake for as many hours as she did it. She used Teams. She used email. She used WhatsApp sometimes with vendors overseas because everybody in global work seemed to use WhatsApp eventually. But Telegram was not part of our shared vocabulary. A code by itself means almost nothing. I know that. One weird notification is not a marriage ending. It is not even an accusation. It is barely a raised eyebrow. But I own a high-end landscaping company, and after enough years in that business, you learn that most large problems show up first in tiny places where something does not belong. A wilted strip in a lawn that should be healthy. One irrigation zone cycling at the wrong hour. A patch of soil staying too wet after the rest of the bed dries correctly. The expensive disaster people notice at the end usually began as one small wrong thing nobody respected soon enough. That was how the code felt. Small, wrong, impossible to explain with the life I thought I was living. My name is Steve Franco. I was 34 when I found out my marriage had been growing a second root system under the surface, one I had never watered and still somehow helped sustain. I live in Brentwood, California. If you do not know it, think heat, money, planned neighborhoods, and people who like the word custom because it sounds better than expensive. My company designed and maintained outdoor spaces for the kind of clients who wanted a clean, modern pool line softened by olive trees, or a driveway approach that made guests feel they had arrived somewhere more important than they probably had. We did stonework, lighting, irrigation, seasonal color, specimen trees, privacy screening, and all the hidden mechanical things that make beauty look effortless after the crew leaves. That mattered more than it might sound. Landscaping is not really about plants once you move into the high-end world. It is about systems. What you see is only half of it. The visible part gets photographed. The hidden part keeps it alive. Lines under soil, drainage you cannot admire, pressure regulators, valves, timers, things that, if neglected, will let a beautiful yard die from underneath, while the owners are still bragging about the roses. That was the lens I lived through. Maybe that was why I noticed the code. Maybe that was why, once I noticed it, I could not quite put it back where it belonged in the category of harmless things. Meredith and I had been married 12 years. She was 38, which meant she was older than me by enough to be noticeable at the beginning and irrelevant by the time life got real. We had built a marriage that made sense to both of us because neither of us wanted to be parented. We were independent people. She traveled. I worked long outdoor days, managed crews, met clients, priced jobs, solved supply problems, and handled enough labor headaches to appreciate quiet at home the way some men appreciate prayer. She had her work, I had mine, and our affection had always been adult instead of needy. No endless check-ins. No public overperformance. No obsession with proving we were in love to people buying salad dressing next to us at the market. From the outside, we looked like the version of marriage people in our town respected. Two competent adults. Good house, good furniture, good money, no chaos, no gossip. When we hosted, everything worked. When we traveled together, nobody argued in hotel lobbies or made silent meals into a sport. When we went out, Meredith carried herself the way she carried herself everywhere, like a woman who had learned early that elegance was a form of leverage. I loved that about her. I still believed some of what I loved was real. That is part of why this hurt the way it did. She was not a cartoon villain. She was a woman I had laughed with in customs lines, sat beside in airport bars, and watched sleep on long flights with one hand still resting over my wrist like even unconscious. She wanted some part of me within reach. Before I tell you how one phone code turned into the end of my marriage, subscribe to Reddit Ride, like the video, and leave a comment. That support helps the channel grow, and it helps stories like this reach the people who know what it feels like when the smallest detail starts making the whole room tilt. That first night, I did not ask her about Telegram. I thought about it. She came downstairs 20 minutes later in one of my old shirts and a pair of soft gray shorts, still smelling like her conditioner, and opened the fridge to look for sparkling water. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah, long day. Always." She smiled. That tired little smile married people give each other when they are both trying to be less tired than they are. I watched her from the island while she bent for the Perrier, then stood back up and drank half the bottle in one pull. Nothing in her face looked wrong. Nothing in her body looked wrong. Nothing in the room said Second Life. That is the problem with hidden systems. The visible layer keeps working almost right until you finally understand that your relief has been helping the lie survive. 2 days later, another verification code came through. Different service, same kind of thing. Your verification code for Signal is 225,614. This one landed harder because I knew what Signal was. Secure messaging. Encrypted. The kind of app people use when privacy is the point, not just the side benefit. Not illegal by itself. Not proof of anything by itself. But not something Meredith and I had ever used. This time she was on a late call with Singapore in the home office. Door half closed, voice low and clipped in that polished way she used when she needed people 3 oceans away to believe she had complete control of their problem. I stared at the notification and then at the door and felt that first real movement inside me. Not rage, not even fear. More like the emotional equivalent of stepping on ground you trusted and realizing it had more give than it should. I closed the iPad. At dinner I asked, "You using any new messaging apps for work lately?" She looked up from her plate. "Why?" "Just wondering. One of my vendors tried to get me onto something called Signal, and it sounded like too much trouble." Her expression did not change, which was almost worse. "Some people overseas use everything," she said. "It's annoying." "Why?" "No reason." She took another bite and said, "If it's for work, half the time it's just some customs broker trying to seem important." Reasonable, smooth, believable. That answer could have been true. It might even have contained truth. The problem was no longer the content. The problem was that I had asked a neutral question, and the answer felt like a fitted cover instead of a lived one. In my line of work, that happens with clients all the time. Someone says they just want low maintenance, and what they mean is they want formal boxwoods, imported stone, and 12 hours a month they do not want to pay for. Someone says drainage is not the issue, and what they mean is they absolutely know drainage is the issue, but hate how expensive invisible fixes sound compared to prettier surface work. People tell you the version of the truth that protects the outcome they want. That was when I started paying attention instead of only noticing. Meredith traveled internationally enough that schedule weirdness was part of the package. Milan, Rotterdam, Singapore, Sao Paulo. She moved through airports the way some people move through shopping malls, without stress and without losing shape. She could sleep in business class, wake up looking like she had planned to be beautiful in another country, and walk straight into a client dinner talking about shipping windows and regulatory exposure like she had not crossed 9 time zones to get there. I admired that competence. I also hid behind it. Because once your spouse's job includes long-haul flights, trade fairs, overseas dinners, hotel bars, and people from 3 continents calling her at all hours, suspicion always has another custom stamp it can blame. For the next few weeks, I did what I always do when something feels wrong in a system. I looked at the water usage. That is metaphorical and literal in my business. If a property is struggling and the owners insist everything is normal, I look at the usage logs. Water tells on the invisible layer. Too much at the wrong hours. Too little in the wrong zones. Repetition where there should be variation. In marriage, spending does the same thing. Meredith and I kept separate business accounts and a shared household account because adulthood had taught us efficiency faster than romance. I handled mortgages, utilities, insurance, pool service, and whatever else wanted auto pay. She handled groceries, travel incidentals, entertaining, and a depressing amount of premium skincare that I used to tease her about until I saw what my own face looked like after 12-hour summer days. I did not go digging like a man looking for a reason to be betrayed. I opened the statements like a man checking for leaks. At first, nothing, then something small. A recurring premium travel concierge service I did not recognize, billed to her personal business card, which would not have meant much if not for the fact that Meredith hated paying for middleman nonsense, as she called it. She booked her own flights, always had, then 2 boutique hotel charges in Madrid on a trip where her company records, which I knew from the printed itinerary on the kitchen counter, listed her in Valencia for most of the week. Then ride charges in Lisbon on nights where she had told me she was at formal dinners outside the city. Then spa charges on what she described as completely dead trade show days, when, according to the exhibitor schedule I found online later, the event was at peak traffic. One lie can be explained. 5 lies begin to suggest architecture. I told myself not to jump. I told myself high-level travel is messy. People move between cities, itineraries change, assistants book upgrades, clients shift locations, and no grown man should lose his mind because a wife spent 2 nights in Madrid when she originally planned on Valencia. Then another detail came up. A transfer from our shared account to one of hers for friend travel coordination. That phrase meant nothing to me at first. We reimbursed each other for all kinds of unsexy life admin. Family gifts, dinner tabs, flights fronted on the wrong card because somebody was in the yard or on the road, and the other person had the laptop open. But when I traced the amount against her statements, it linked to airline tickets for 3 women traveling to Mykonos in the middle of what I thought was a business stopover in Athens. 3 women, not colleagues from her company. Women I recognized from Instagram and dinner parties. Meredith's friends, beautiful, polished, unserious in ways that only money and good bone structure let people survive. That was the first time the shape changed. Because a private affair is one kind of betrayal. A social second life, one with female friends accompanying and presumably covering, is another. It tells you that the lie did not just fit into cracks around the marriage. It had culture, ritual, witnesses, maybe even cheerleaders. I sat in my truck outside the nursery after seeing that charge pattern, hands still on the wheel, the windshield full of junipers and bougainvillea and employee forklifts moving bagged soil around like ordinary life had not just widened into something uglier. The middle part of a betrayal story is never one clean descent. It is loops, the same question in different lighting, the same private ache wearing different shoes. At home, Meredith was still Meredith. That might have been the worst part. She still knew when I had sunburn coming before I admitted it. She still remembered which of my crews had a guy whose daughter was sick and asked after her by name. She still reached for my hand in grocery stores when we crossed the parking lot without thinking about it. She still made the bed on weekdays and left it wrecked on Sundays because she said one day a week should look lived in. That tenderness kept mutinying against the evidence. People like to imagine that once proof starts coming in, clarity makes you strong. Sometimes it just makes you tired in a new and more humiliating way. The next hard piece was not spending. It was timing. Meredith had a trip to Barcelona in October for a trade conference on agricultural equipment and shipping agreements. Not my world, but close enough that I understood the broad mechanics. Long meetings, exhibitor dinners, people in blazers saying corridor and throughput like the words themselves moved cargo. The night before she left, she was packing in our bedroom and moving with that efficient pre-trip focus I had always found calming. Chargers, adapter, blazers folded on the bed, travel steamer, the small white leather case she used for jewelry. I was on my side of the room rolling up invoices because one of my foremen could lose paper in a locked room. "Can you grab my carry-on scale from the hall closet?" she said. I found the scale, then on the way back caught sight of a second passport sleeve in the upper shelf box where we kept old travel documents and extra currency envelopes. Same brand as hers. Newer, navy leather, Empty. I brought her the scale. Why do you have a second passport holder? I asked. She barely looked up. The old one split at the seam months ago. It was casual. Immediate. She sounded mildly bored. I had even asked. Only her old one was still in the dresser. I had seen it there 2 days earlier looking for cufflinks. I did not push. That was a theme of the middle. Almost pushing. Choosing silence. Not because silence is noble, but because premature confrontation helps liars more than it helps husbands. The day after she landed in Barcelona, I checked our shared phone carrier logs. Not content, just connection patterns. Roaming spikes. Numbers not saved in my phone. Again, not something I did out of natural suspicion. Something I did because when irrigation pressure drops in one zone, you look at valve timing before you accuse the lawn of being weak. There was one number. Repeated. Long calls at strange hours California time, and short bursts around hotel check-ins overseas. Sometimes during trips, sometimes the day before, sometimes the day after. The number mapped to a UK country code, then bounced through uprooted traces that went nowhere useful. That alone did not prove adultery. It proved orchestration. When she came home from Spain, I met her at the airport because that had always been our habit. No flowers, no performance, just the ride home, her shoes kicked off in the passenger seat, and the relieved exhale of somebody back from being hyper-competent in other countries. She looked beautiful and tired. I kissed her. She held me hard for one moment longer than usual and said, I needed home. My body reacted before my mind did. That is another ugly truth of marriage betrayal. The body is sometimes slower to accept what the mind already sees. On the drive back, she talked about tariffs, one stubborn Dutch client on video calls, and how one of the women from her circle might join her next spring in Portugal because it was safer and more fun to have company on the dead days. Safer and more fun. There it was in her own mouth now. The women friends. Casual. Normalized. A second network beneath the first. Which friend? I asked. Maybe Dana. Maybe Pillar. Depends who can get away. Get away from what? She smiled out the passenger window. Life. That line stayed with me for weeks. Get away from life. As if our marriage, our house, her own choices, and the very ordinary dignity of adulthood were some oppressive whether she deserved relief from. The deeper middle reveal came from a woman named Dana herself. Not the version Meredith mentioned lightly in the car. Another woman entirely. Dana Bell was married to a venture capital guy who used my company for seasonal work at their weekend place in Napa. She called me on a Friday morning and asked if I had time for coffee the next day because she needed a male opinion on something delicate. That phrasing already told me too much. We met at a place in Walnut Creek where rich people pretend espresso is a hobby. Dana did not waste much time. I am going to say something ugly, she said. I am saying it because if someone knew this about me, I would want the cruelty of the truth instead of the softness of being protected. I sat back and waited. She looked at her untouched cappuccino, then at me. Your wife's travel circle is not innocent. The women know more than you think. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to cover. Enough to normalize. Meredith and two of them were in Mykonos with men last spring. Not husbands. Not clients. I know because Pillar got drunk in Palm Beach and thought telling the story made her sound younger than she is. The air seemed to thin a little. How sure are you? Dana looked me dead in the eye. Enough that I am risking friendships by sitting here. Why tell me? Because there is a difference between girls behaving badly and a wife building a second life, while her husband thinks the calendar is the truth. A second life. That phrase was too accurate to argue with. Who were the men? I asked. She shook her head. I know one was British. One was from Sao Paulo maybe. One was just somebody from trade. That is how they talk about it. Like it's weather. Like it's travel. Like what happens elsewhere belongs to no one at home. That line gutted me in a very clean way. What happens elsewhere belongs to no one at home. I thanked her. She looked sick with relief and shame both. On the drive back, I pulled over once because my hands were shaking too badly to keep the truck straight. I sat there on the shoulder with walnut orchards on one side and some expensive development going up on the other, and realized the betrayal was bigger than I had allowed myself to name. It was not an affair, or not only an affair. It was a culture, A wild second life abroad. Hotel parties. Men rotating through foreign cities. Female friends turning themselves into camouflage and audience. Then home again. Brentwood kitchen. Good wine. Proper wife. International work story. Plane delay. Jet lag. Photos of museum dinners and export panels and smiling delegates. Everything neat on the surface. Everything rotting underneath. I did not confront her that weekend. Again, that sounds weak when told simply. It was not weakness. It was sequencing. By then I knew enough that if I confronted too early, I would get denial, partial truth, tears, a few names withheld, and an argument about privacy instead of reality. I wanted reality, so I moved money. Not vindictively, protectively, transferred operating reserves my business needed out of any reachable overlap. Separated discretionary holdings, called my accountant, and framed it as prudent restructuring tied to increased liability concerns. Then I told my attorney the truth. Her name was Marisol Grant, and she handled complicated divorces for complicated people without ever sounding thrilled by either. I brought her copies, statements, carrier logs, transfer patterns, photos I had quietly taken of the second passport holder, the app codes, and the hotel confirmations I eventually found in a hidden travel email Meredith kept signed in on the kitchen iPad, because even smart people become lazy inside the systems they think they own. Marisol reviewed everything. Then she said, "This is not one emotional affair. This is organized compartmentalization." That was the cleanest phrase I heard the whole time. Organized compartmentalization. Yes, she went on, and the spending shows she believed distance gave her immunity. That's common with international patterns. People treat geography like morality. I looked at her. What would you do if it were you? I would know more before I spoke. I already feel like I know too much. She nodded once, then know enough that nothing she says can pull you back into confusion. That became the mission. By early November, Meredith had another overseas trip lined up. Paris first, then Rotterdam, then a hotel event in Lisbon attached to a trade coalition gathering. The kind of phrase global business uses when people need excuses for dressing beautifully around other ambitious people near expensive alcohol. I found the Lisbon piece in a forwarded itinerary she forgot to delete from the hidden email account. The hotel was not just a hotel. It was a private waterfront property hosting an after-hours party for delegates, sponsors, and selected guests. I looked at the guest add-ons. 3 names I recognized. Meredith, Pillar, Dana's friend Veronica, plus 1 discretionary companion line, left blank under internal notes. I booked a flight that afternoon. Not impulsively, deliberately. Business class, because exhaustion makes men sloppy, and I was not flying across the Atlantic to be sloppy. I told my operations manager I was taking 3 days for supplier meetings in Portugal, because landscaping, like every other business, has enough imported stone and fixture nonsense floating through Europe these days to make that plausible. I left my foreman in charge, sent the right emails, paid the right bills. Then I packed 1 suit, 3 shirts, and the version of myself I hoped would not embarrass me when the time came. On the flight over, I did not sleep much. Not because I was panicked, because I kept revisiting the same humiliations from different angles. Meredith's hand on my knee in airport lounges. Her tired smile after long-haul returns. The way she would sometimes say home in a voice that made it sound sacred. The fact that she had likely meant it, in some partial and self-serving way, even while boarding planes into other lives. By the time I landed in Lisbon, I was no longer angry in the hot sense. I was something colder, more useful, hurt certainly, but aware. That word mattered. Mature masculine aware. Not because I was performing manhood for myself, because awareness is the only dignity left once fantasy burns off. The hotel party was exactly what people like Meredith would build if you gave them enough money and anonymity in a foreign city. Roofed up, music low enough to sound expensive, white furniture nobody actually relaxed into, women in dresses pretending their shoes did not hurt, men who wore confidence like inherited fragrance, city lights beyond the terrace, river dark below, glass everywhere catching reflections that made everybody look more glamorous and less accountable. I arrived late on purpose, not in a scene-stealing way. Quietly, one dark suit, no rushing, no wild eyes, just a husband crossing an ocean because the structure was already dead and now needed daylight. I saw Meredith before she saw me. She stood near the far side of the terrace laughing with a man who was not Richard, not British-looking, not old enough to be her father figure. Just another polished man in an open-collar shirt with one hand low on her back as if touch were already agreed upon. Pilar was beside them, talking to another man. Veronica stood at the bar with 2 drinks and the bored poise of somebody for whom this was not even the most reckless Tuesday of the year. Then Meredith leaned in and kissed the man full on the mouth. Not hesitantly, not drunk and sloppy. Practiced. That was the scene. Not one affair partner. Not one secret romance. A pattern so normalized it had lost any need for reverence. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds longer than I should have, just long enough to let my body take the full hit before I moved. When I did, it was straight toward her. She saw me at the same moment Pilar did. Pilar's face changed first. Then Meredith turned, still half smiling from the kiss, and saw her husband standing in Lisbon in a suit she had not packed for. Everything in her body stopped. Not metaphorically. Stopped. Her glass remained half raised. Her shoulders froze. Even the social smile failed in place, instead of fading naturally. "Steve," she said. The man beside her looked from her to me, and understood enough to step back, without yet understanding what kind of room he had been standing in. I stopped a few feet away. No shouting. No threats. No performance for strangers. I had not flown that far to make myself the spectacle. "You live like this when you leave the country," I said. Her mouth opened, then closed. The terrace noise around us seemed to recede, though I know it probably did not. That is how shock works. It narrows the room to one set of eyes, and whatever truth they finally cannot avoid. "Steve, let's not do this here." "Here is exactly right," I said. Pilar disappeared. Veronica turned fully away, as if angle alone could grant innocence. Meredith took a step toward me. Her voice dropped. "I can explain." "No," I said. "You can reduce. You can edit. You can try to turn years into one bad night in a city where you thought nothing counted. You cannot explain this." The man beside her said something in accented English about leaving, and I looked at him only once. "That would be smart," I said. He left. So did the others gradually, because wealthy people have a 6th sense for scandal and a 7th for not being seen near it. Soon it was just Meredith and me at the edge of the terrace, with the river behind her, and the city making itself beautiful for people who deserved less of it than they were getting. She said, "I never wanted you to find out like this." That line was almost enough to make me laugh. "No," I said. "You wanted not to be found out." "That's different." Tears came fast then, not from confession but from collapse. She was not crying over what she had done. Not first. She was crying because the 2 worlds had touched at last, and neither could survive it. "Please," she said. "Come inside. Let me talk to you privately." "This is private," I replied. "We crossed an ocean for it." Her face broke a little more. "It wasn't always like this." "No, it became like this because you maintained it." That line hit. I could see it. You maintained it. Not slipped. Not drifted. Maintained. She covered her mouth with one hand. "How long?" I asked. Her shoulders shook once. "Steve, how long?" "Years," she said. The river moved black behind her. Somewhere on another section of the terrace, someone laughed too loudly at something unrelated and unforgivable in its irrelevance. "How many?" I asked. She cried harder then, which was answer enough in shape if not in count. So many partners, the prompt of her life had said. Now there it was in human form, not as a number but as the look a wife gives when she knows the quantity itself is part of the wound. I said, "You were proper at home and feral everywhere else." She flinched like I had struck her. That was the truth of it. At home she had been composed, efficient, elegant, caring. Abroad she had been improvising a second body, one fed by foreign cities, willing female witnesses, hotel parties, and men whose names I never wanted because names imply stories, and I was no longer in the business of offering them romance. I did not stay all night. That surprises people when I tell it plainly. They want a movie, a scream, a spilled drink, a punch to some European jaw. What I wanted was finality. I told her my attorney would contact her. I told her I had already protected what needed protecting. I told her not to bother trying to race me home emotionally, because I had arrived before her in every way that mattered. Then I gave her the line that ended the marriage for good. You treated distance like permission, I said. I treated marriage like a place. She started to say my name again. I walked away before she could finish it. Back in my room, I sat in a chair facing the dark window and felt the first real wave of grief arrive now that action had ended. It was not noble. It was ugly and quiet and physical. 12 years collapsing into one hotel chair in Lisbon, while traffic moved below, and some part of me still could not fully accept that the woman I loved had made an international habit of leaving the marriage in carry-on luggage. I came home 2 days later. Meredith was already back by then. She must have taken the next available route after I left the terrace, which told me even in devastation, she still knew how to manage a logistics crisis. When I opened the front door, she was sitting at the kitchen island in the same house where I had once watched her drink sparkling water in my old shirt and tell me she needed home. She looked ruined, not theatrically, not messily, just structurally, like something in her had finally been forced to bear its real weight. I set my bag down. She stood. Steve. I held up a hand. No rehearsed version. Not tonight. She sat again. I stayed standing. What followed was quieter than Lisbon and somehow worse. No dresses, no city lights, no river, just our kitchen, the lemons in the bowl, the expensive quiet, and the final obligation to speak plainly. She tried all the expected doors. I was lonely. I felt invisible. It only got this bad because travel made it feel unreal. Some of the women made it seem normal. Nothing at home ever felt wrong, which I heard the way it was meant and the way it was true. Nothing at home ever felt wrong to her because she was feeding the rest elsewhere. I listened, not to forgive, to understand the exact shape of the rot, so I would never be tempted to call it something prettier later. At last I said, "You did not have one secret. You had a structure." She cried harder then. "I know." "No," I said. "You know now because I crossed an ocean into it. Before that you called it excitement." She lowered her face into both hands. "I never thought you'd find out. That honesty at least was clean." "I know," I said. "That was your biggest mistake." She moved into the guest room that night. 3 weeks later, she moved out entirely. The legal part was less dramatic than the emotional part and more important in the long run. Money separated. Liabilities ring-fenced. My business protected. The house listed. Her travel habits no longer my concern, except where accountants required overlap to become numbers before they could stop being problems. She lost more than a husband. Some of her female circle disappeared once the glamour burned off, and the truth sounded less like adventure than pathology. A few men she thought were private became impolite once she was no longer distant, married, and exciting. Wild second lives depend heavily on being temporary. Bring them into daylight, and many of the participants look smaller immediately. I did not hate her. That is true even now. Hate would have simplified the grief into something hotter and more theatrical than it deserved. What I felt was colder, more adult. She had wanted to feel free of consequence, free of repetition, free of ordinary domestic gravity. She had mistaken transgression for vitality. I understood enough to name it, not enough to forgive it, not enough to take her back. Healing came in ordinary places. At the nursery, checking root balls in morning fog and realizing my thoughts stayed with the trees instead of flying to Lisbon. At job sites, talking clients out of bad stone choices and feeling my own judgment return as something usable, not just wounded. At home, opening the iPad and seeing no strange verification codes, no hidden channels, no secondary system humming under the visible one. Months later, one of my foremen asked me why I had started obsessing so much over irrigation inspections on finished jobs. Because beautiful things die quietly from underneath if no one checks the hidden lines, I told him. He nodded like I was only talking about landscaping. Maybe that was kinder. Maybe it was enough. I live alone now in a smaller place, with less glass and fewer opportunities for performance. Work still runs long. Clients still ask for impossible things. Brentwood is still Brentwood, but the difference is the air in my own life no longer feels double-layered. What you see is what is there. That matters more to me now than romance used to. Meredith called once, months after the papers were signed, and asked if I ever thought we had been happy. I took a long time before answering. Yes, I said. I think I was. That was not cruelty. It was precision. I think I was. Because whatever she had built beside that happiness had not erased my experience of it entirely, only contaminated its borders. I refused to surrender every good thing to her worst choices. That is another kind of dignity, holding what was true without letting it excuse what came after. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Reddit Ride, like the video, and leave a comment. That support helps the channel grow, and it helps keep stories like this coming for the people who know that betrayal is often not a single act at all, but a whole hidden life waiting for one wrong notification to bring the roots into daylight. She thought other countries made her choices weightless. I learned pain travels just as well as pleasure. Only one of those was worth bringing home.